It's good to see you. It's good to be here with you again. I guess in keeping with this morning's kind of, what we've done so far. Rich, I think you should just come up here and preach the sermon. We all want to hear you preach the sermon. So we're in Exodus 18 this morning. And it's an interesting little story. I don't know if you, while we were reading it, you were thinking, now what in the world are we going to hear from this strange little story? It is quite a moment in time. It's the story, really, of a family meal. A family meal between Jethro and Moses. I don't know if you caught it, but over and over again, it's like, hey, just in case you forgot, Jethro is Moses' father-in-law. It's like the most repeated term in this whole thing. These two come together to have a meal. According to Ann Fishel, currently in the United States, only 30% of families ever have dinner together on a regular basis. She should know. She's the director of a program called Family Dinner Project. It's an organization that helps millions of people in this country try and figure out how to do something that seems simple, but I think as a lot of us know is kind of complicated, which is how do you have dinner together? The work matters for all kinds of reasons. Strangely enough, what they figured out is that all kinds of things from kind of psychological health to physical health are bettered when people eat together. They don't know exactly why it is, it's just kind of the way it goes. Doesn't matter what the family looks like, how it's made up, or even what they eat necessarily, but eating together has something to do with our flourishing in the world. I wonder if you've experienced that. I don't know if you grew up eating family meals often with your family, or if you do now. I grew up in a messed up family where that happened sometimes, and when it did, it was usually kind of like a Cold War, right? We were just trying not to set off nuclear weapons at the dinner table. But I do remember just some meals that our family had. Maybe it was at Thanksgiving or Christmas. We're entering into the kind of holiday season maybe you're looking forward to, or not looking forward to, family meals coming up. But haven't we all kind of had that experience of kind of a great family meal? In today's passage, we see, again, this kind of family meal between Moses and Jethro and some others. It's a very simple meal, but it's an incredibly significant meal. Here, in this meal, at this point in the book of Exodus, we see family transferred into fellowship. The title of my sermon this morning is From Family to Fellowship. That's what happens here. That's the significance of this passage. If you wanted to know, okay, what's this weird little story doing in the Bible that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and not a whole lot goes on, especially in light of all of the crazy things that have been happening for so many chapters, well, you have family transferred into fellowship. Here's what I think we should learn from this story. And all the kind of interesting details that are here, there's one thing above all else that we should learn. It's that the proclamation of God's acts produces God's fellowship. If you were to ask the question, how does God's fellowship, the gathering of God's people, come into being? It's through the proclamation of God's acts. The proclamation of those acts produces God's fellowship. Here we see it in the case of Moses and Jethro. It's an encouraging story, and it also is a story that I think provokes us to hopeful action in the world. We'll look at the story in three different parts. It's a very simple kind of story. It's three things that kind of happen. There's a meeting, then there's a message, and there's a meal. That's all it is, right there. That's going to happen. If you're thinking, man, maybe there's some kind of secret thing that happens here, there is not. It is very plain. It begins with this meeting. A meeting between Jethro, the father-in-law of Moses, and Moses himself. Now, the meeting takes place, as you heard last week, after kind of an amazing battle. that is won in the most ridiculous way, kind of humanly imaginable. Just keep your arms up and you'll win. And so that has happened, and that has happened right after some even more ridiculous events have happened, where food and water are provided in the wilderness. And if you ask the question, well, why were they in the wilderness? Well, that's an even more ridiculous story, where they passed through a Red Sea, kind of opened up and then swallowed up the Egyptians. If you ask the question, well, why were they going through the Red Sea in the first place? It's because God had led them to that place. That's what I preached the last time I was here. And why were they led to that place? Well, it's because before that, they were in slavery in Egypt, and then there was the 10 plagues. This is like the most action-packed part of the Bible. And yet here it all slows down for this one little meeting between Moses and Jethro, his father-in-law. Jethro brings Zipporah, and who's Moses' wife, and their 2 sons. We don't know exactly how long it had been since Moses had seen his wife. We're not told like when he sent her away. We know that happened at some point, but we're not sure why. But it must have been a joy to reunite now. So much stuff had taken place, and now Moses gets to see his family again. It's the first time. Zipporah and the children are not the main focus of the story. It's really just Jethro and Moses. And it had been a minute since these two had seen each other. The situation where they last saw each other was in chapter 4. All the way back when Moses was just kind of an escaped, Egyptian-looking weirdo wandering around in the wilderness who had just kind of stumbled along some women at a well. Here, interestingly enough, as they meet, and we're told that it's the wife and the 2 children, here for the first time, strangely in the book, we learn the names of Moses' 2 kids. And you might wonder, like, well, why are the names... you always ought to be curious when you read the Bible. It's not just that he names the kids, the author. He names the kids and then tells us what the names mean. Now, we don't know what the name word Jethro means, so he's not just like in the minute of like, let me just explain what all the names mean. So anytime names get explained, you should pay attention because they're usually important. And here, they're very important. Here, the names of the 2 children actually summarize the story of what has gone on in this book. Notice... right here, verses 3 and 4. If you're like, what is the book of Exodus about up to this point? Here's the whole story. Verse 3, the name of the one was Gershom, for he said, I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. If you remember back when Moses first married Zipporah and they had a child, Moses was married, had a new family, but wasn't exactly excited about life. He was away from his people. He was away from his land. And so he names his child something. Can you imagine just like every time you call the name of your child, you're like, I am a sojourner in a foreign land. I don't belong here. Hey, I don't belong here. Get to the dinner table. That was part of the story. But then there's a second child, and his name, as it says here in verse 4, the name of the other was Eliezer, for he said, the God of my father was my help and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. That's the other part of the story. I was a sojourner, and God saved me from the hand of Pharaoh. That's right there, and the 2 names of the children is the whole history of God's people up to that point in time. They all meet, as we're told in verse 5, at the mountain of God. And it's a meeting that's rather interesting. I don't know if these acts like make any sense to you. There's this kind of calling ahead, hey, I'm coming to you. And then there's like some bowing and some kissing going on. We live in 21st century America. We don't do any of this kind of stuff. We like send a text, right? Like, hey, by the way, I'll be at your house at 6. And then we just kind of show up. And we're like, hey, how's it going? No tense. There's no like kissing and all that kind of stuff, usually. Here, though, we're dealing with a very different culture, and what we see here in this kind of meeting and in this formality is the meeting between 2 equals, and that's important. Remember that Jethro is the priest of Midian. He's this priest of a religion that we don't know of exactly what it is, but he's a very honored man in his society, and here he's meeting what has now become his equal, Moses, his son-in-law. So it should be that Moses is all deferential, but he's not on the same level. But here, the way that they're treated, it is as if they're on the same level. The question is, what is it in this meeting that has made Moses and Jethro now come to the same level, when before it was Jethro was in charge, he was the priest, and Moses was just this escaped Egyptian? Well, the answer to that question comes in the message of the story. We've seen the meeting, and now there's the message. Notice what it says right there in verse 8. Then Moses told his father-in-law all that the Lord had done to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians for Israel's sake, all the hardship that had come upon them in the way, and how the Lord had delivered them. Can you imagine what that must have been like? You're Jethro, sitting in a tent, listening to Moses, your son-in-law, now with a horde of people, both Egyptian and Israelite alike, who have come to the mountain of God. You invite Moses into the tent and go, all right, what happened? We know that that Jethro has some kind of idea, because look at what it says in verse 1. Heard of all that God had done for Moses and for Israel his people, how the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. He knew that God had done something before they even meet. And you might ask the question, like, how did they know? Well, he didn't read the news. There wasn't that. He wasn't checking social media. There wasn't that. But there wasn't a whole lot to do where Jethro lived. And this was an amazing event even during this time. Word must have spread and had actually run before Moses. And so Jethro's like, okay, all right, tell me exactly what happened. Can you imagine like what it must have been like to hear Moses give the play-by-play of like what it actually was like to go through the Red Sea? What it was actually like to be like, no, seriously, God said take a stick, hit a rock, and water's going to come out of it. And then I hit the rock, and it happened. Now, as interesting as it would be to hear Moses tell the story, just from the dramatic first-person perspective, the great thing is that you and I know the content of what he said. It's right here in the book. We don't have to guess it like what he said. We actually know the story ourselves. It's what you've been studying for the last few months. What's interesting about the story is that Moses doesn't kind of shy away from both the beauty and the brutality of what's happened. Do you notice that? Look again at verse 8. All the hardship that had come upon them in the way, and how the Lord had delivered them. Both of these things are important. How hard it had been, and what the Lord had done. This is always the case. All of the story matters. And the response to the message that Moses shares on the part of Jethro is frankly astounding. I don't know if it just shocked you the first time you heard it, but I just want to read it again. It's verses 9 through 11. And just remember that this comes out of the mouth of the priest, the guy in charge of a different religion. He hears the story of what God had done, and then says this in verse 9. Jethro rejoiced for all the good that the Lord had done to Israel, and that he had delivered them out of the hand of the Egyptians. Jethro said, "Blessed be the Lord, who has delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians," in case you missed it the first time, "out of the hand of Pharaoh, and has delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians," in case you missed it both the first time and the second time. "Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods, because in this affair they dealt arrogantly with the people." I don't know if you caught it. I'll read it again. "Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods," including the ones that Jethro himself had been worshiping and serving up until that point. hears the story of God's mighty acts and goes, all right, that's a great story. It doesn't go, good for you, I'm glad you have your religious beliefs and I have my religious beliefs, and it looks like we all have religious beliefs. That's wonderful. Now something changes here. He hears the story of what God has done, rejoices in what God has done, and goes, now I know that your God is better than my gods. As amazing as that is, know this. This is the confession of every true believer. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods. It's not like those exact words, but that's the spirit of what it means for somebody to believe in God. God had brought Israel out of Egypt, through the sea, through the wilderness, to this point for one reason. Just one. That reason was to demonstrate who he is. It's to demonstrate who he is to the Israelites, the people of God, and all of their neighbors. That's it. We got to remember that Israel was in Egypt for 400 years. They didn't know anything about this God. And so God was teaching them patiently, step by step, through these amazing acts, who he was. But he also was doing it for the sake of the whole world. For the sake of the Egyptians, so the Egyptians would know, and now so that Jethro would know. And Jethro figures it out. The goal of God had come to fruition in part in the rejoicing of this priest of Midian. The movement from family to fellowship was accomplished simply by Moses telling Jethro what God had done. I don't know how long you've been a Christian. I don't know if you are a Christian. If you are a Christian, you've probably heard about evangelism. I would be curious if we just had like kind of one of those testimonial booths. And it was like, okay, what is evangelism? And you just kind of have to immediately on the spot tell the camera what evangelism is. Think about it for a moment. What would you say evangelism is? You don't have to say it out loud. And while there's lots of different ways of describing what evangelism is, I think at the base of it, here's what evangelism is. We see here Moses playing the role of an evangelist. What an evangelist is one who proclaims the acts of God to other people. That's it. I think this is so important because I think so often we think, wow, I can't believe that some people are evangelists. They go and they get to do all, oh wow, I could never be an evangelist. I don't think you're right. Now, let me be clear. Some of us are much better at like public speaking than other people. I know that in the top 10 like fears of all human beings, public speaking is like always consistently in like the top 10. How many of you are just terrified? Just raise your hand. How many of you are like, ooh, I do not like public speaking? All right, good. Good chunk of you. I love public speaking. I think I was born with a microphone in my hand. But some of us are really good at private speaking, right? Like I love talking to people one-on-one. Like, oh, I could never do that. Oh, I could talk to somebody though. And the reality is whether you love public speaking or hate public speaking, all of us can be evangelists. All you have to know is what the mighty acts of God are. Here, all Moses did was tell Jethro what God had done. That's it. If you want to know, like, why should I read the Bible? Why should I know this story? Well, it's because it's through the proclamation of God's acts that God produces his fellowship. That's how it works. It doesn't happen by magic. It doesn't happen by just kind of like angels showing up in a room and go, you should believe in God. And they're like, okay, I guess that's going to happen. It happens through simply, from beginning of this book to the end of this big book, the time, languages, cultures, it happens simply as people go, hey, let me tell you what God has done. And here's the craziest part. Here's the craziest part. The story that Moses would have told Jethro would have been pretty great. You and I know the details of the story, or the basics of the story. I'm sure Moses had some details that were just kind of unique to him, and he would have been able to tell it from first person, and we can't. I know some of us are older in this congregation. I don't think any of us were there at the crossing of the Red Sea. But perhaps the craziest thing to me about this whole thing is that the story that you and I could tell is better than the story Moses could have even dreamed of. Just think about that for a minute. The story that you can tell is 1,000 times better than the story that Moses could have ever dreamed of. You go, hold on a second, Jeremy, what are you talking about? Maybe you're sitting here going, I don't even know what the heck this story is. Well, some of you are kind of visual learners, so let me just show you. Moses could have said this much of the story. That's it. That's all he do. He doesn't know the future. He doesn't know anything that's happening after this. You and I can tell all of this part of the story. You go, what is that story? I mean, shoot, man, I just became a Christian like 3 weeks ago, and I don't know this whole story. Like, there's stuff like Numbers, and you know what the book of Numbers is full of? I'll give you one guess. Nailed it. Numbers. And then, like, there's some stuff in here where you're like, I don't know what any of this is doing. Well, one of the things that you should do if you have the time is to pick up something like the book by Vaughn Roberts. It's called God's Big Picture. It's short. It's like 150 pages. And it helps you understand the entirety of this story. But here's the way I would tell the story. This isn't in my notes, right? I'll put my notes like this. And I don't know, I don't have this memorized, but here's the way I would tell the story. The story that Moses could never tell. That before even the events that Moses was present for, way back at the beginning, God created everything. Everything. And it was great. And the problem is that you and I, we rebelled against God. Now, I know you and I weren't there, but it's what humans did, and you and I do it every day, so we understand what this is. And if you're like, I don't think I've ever rebelled against God. I'm a pretty good person. Like, first of all, no, you're not. Neither am I. But second of all, it's the things that, if you're like, what does it mean to rebel against God? It's simply this. It's the things that you know you should do and you don't do, and the things you know you shouldn't do and you do. We're all on the same page now, aren't we? You get that uncomfortable feeling, oh no, I've now rebelled against God. And the most amazing thing is that though that happens in the story, like on page 2, literally, God then immediately says, okay, guess what? I'm going to put back together what you broke. That begins by the calling of Abraham. He's like, okay, and you, I'm gonna bless the world. And Abraham's like, great, I don't know how that's going to happen, but we'll figure it out. It doesn't look really great. When Abraham dies, he's only got one kid and no promised land except for a cave in which to die. That's it. And yet from that little seed, a massive tree grows into this big old group of people. People who found themselves in Egypt under the slavery to the Egyptians. Well, what we now know, what Moses knew personally, is that those people get liberated from slavery in Egypt, get into the wilderness, and now they've been told this story, but the crazy thing is that they don't stay in the wilderness. God continues to guide them. It's going to take a minute. Next week, you're going to get to the mountain, and then you're at the mountain for a long time. But eventually, they're going to move on, and they're going to go into the promised land. Once they get in there, things are not going to go so hot. You see, because God's people, you would think it was just like happily ever after. There's not any of that part of the Bible until you get to the very end. And it's not because you and I are great, but because God is. We'll get there in a minute. What happens is once they go into the land, things go real bad real quick. So God raises up judges. And the judges actually bring order, but the problem is that judges die. And then the people go back to not so great, and then another judge comes. God's a very merciful God. But the judges don't work. So people get it king. The kings, that's a raging dumpster fire, just to put it mildly. If you thought the judges were bad, the kings, not so great. Some of the kings are better than other kings, but most of the kings are pretty bad. The prophets come along, and what the prophets do is they tell everybody, guess what? We are going in the wrong direction, and if we keep doing this, we are going to go into exile. We're actually have to leave the land. And they do. Why? Because God said that was going to happen, and so it happens. Yet in God's incredible kindness, he actually brings them back to the land. Why? Because that's what he said he would do. And when they come back to the land, it seems like everything's going to be great, but it's not. It's just sad. The young people are like, yay, we're here. And the older people are like, this is really lame. We're back, but it's not great. And things are kind of like that for a long time. Until one day, the craziest thing happens. Crazier than the crossing of the Red Sea. Crazier than hitting a rock and water coming out of it. Crazier than holding your hands up and winning a war. God, capital G, God, the God that now Jethro realizes is the God greater than all the gods, he becomes human. Now maybe you're like, Jeremy, of course. That's Jesus Christ, second person of the Trinity. That's called the Incarnation. I know all about it. We celebrate at Christmas. Good, but don't ever get past the craziness of what the story is. The reason why conversion is a miracle, people believing is a miracle, is because this story makes no sense. Like, no sense. If you're like, no, it's a perfectly rational story. No, it's not. God becomes a human, a baby human, born of a real woman in a real moment in time. And then the story gets crazier. Because that child then does exactly the opposite of you and me. What I mean by that is, he doesn't get involved in any of that sin stuff. What he's supposed to do, he does. And what he's not supposed to do, he doesn't do. At every moment through the entirety of his life. And then, just in case you thought that was great, which it is, he then goes, I'm going to die for all the people that don't do that. I know. It doesn't make any sense. He actually does. Hung on a Roman cross, crucified, killed. Because you and I do what we're not supposed to do and don't do what we're supposed to do. It sounds messed up, but the reality is that's the only way to make things right between us and God, because God is perfect, and the perfect God is the kind of God you want. Because if it's not a perfect God, then it's an imperfect God, and he's really not a God that's greater than all the other gods. He's just like all the other gods. The death is the sad part. But then, in case that wasn't crazy enough, he raises from the dead. Again, this story makes no sense. But it's true. And having come to life, he then conquers death, raises up into heaven, and goes, I'm coming back to make everything right. That's the story of God's mighty acts that you and I get to tell. It's 1,000,000 times better than the story Moses ever could tell. We tell it to people who are part of our families, our fathers-in-law, and also our friends on the block. And we're just like, believe me, I don't understand it all the time. Maybe you understand it. You can come up and explain it to me afterwards. Maybe you're sitting there and you're like, I don't believe this, but like, I don't understand that. Great, let's talk about it afterwards. But I'm just going to tell you, there's no way to fully understand this story. But it's in the telling of that story. It's in the proclamation of those acts that God's fellowship gets produced. I mean, isn't that true? If you think back, how did you become a Christian? I don't know. Maybe you're like, I was just born in church. Yeah, but you heard the story over and over and over and over again. And you didn't hear it from the greatest preacher of all time. I know that for a fact only because the greatest preacher of all time doesn't exist. Like, that's not a person. I train preachers. Believe me, I know. It's not the amazingness with which the story is told. Some of us tell the story better than others, but it's just that we tell the story. And sometimes God is kind enough to let us see people go, just like Jethro. Now I know. Now I know that your God is greater than all the gods. It only happens if you and I open up our mouths. That's it. But when we open up our mouths, sometimes, not all the time, sometimes people go, yeah, that story is terrible. I don't like that story. You're like, okay, have a nice day. But you still tell the story. I'll admit that the task seems impossible. And the task only seems more impossible the longer time goes on. Like, we're living in a complicated time. There's like fires, right? There's wars. There's all kinds of just unrest. It's just like, when is it going to end? The answer is like, I don't know. And the answer is also one day. But the answer is also like, not until that day comes. But the reality is that as impossible as it seems, you and I have received the craziest promise from the same guy who resurrected from the dead. After he resurrects from the dead, Jesus says this. I'm sure you've heard this passage a million times, but it bears repeating at this moment. Jesus, once he resurrects from the dead, meets with his disciples for the last time in the book of Matthew. And in Matthew chapter 28, Jesus, resurrected from the dead, all authority in heaven and earth is what he says. That's how he starts. He gathers his troops, Matthew chapter 28, verse 18, is what we call the Great Commission. The part that we always skip is the most important part. Here's how it starts. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. That's all you need to know about Jesus. If Jesus would have said this at any other point in his ministry, if I was his disciple, I'd be like, yeah, I don't know. The people, some of them like you, a lot of them don't. Me, I've got my doubts. But now Jesus has died and risen from the dead. There's no questioning at this point. When he goes, all authority on heaven and earth is given to me, you go like, okay, all right, whatever you're about to say, I believe you. And he goes on to say this. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. I have a simple question for you. It's a very easy question. It's a yes or no question. Have we arrived at the end of the age? Hint, that means everything is over. I heard that no in the back. That is correct. No. If no, then logic would tell us that if Jesus is with his people always, then he's with us now. Doesn't look like much. But the hopefulness of us sharing this message is that the resurrected Jesus is with us as we do the very simple act of telling people the mighty acts of God. And then, shockingly, he uses us to see people go from family to fellowship. I don't understand it, but it's how the church rolls on. So question, who are you going to tell the story to this week? I don't know. But here's what I would encourage you to do today. Just pray. Simple prayer. Prayer's got a couple parts. I'm making this up as I go. But here's the prayer. Dear God, help me speak to one person this week about your mighty acts. Help them listen. Help me know what to say. And help me remember what the story is. That's it. I don't know. Oh, and then if he does, if you do open the door, just give me the boldness to actually say something. That's it. And you'll be amazed at what happens. I don't like evangelizing in person. It's the weirdest thing. I can't describe it. You put me in front of like 1,000 complete unbelievers who are really mad about what I have to say, I'm happy as a clam. You put me just one-on-one with them, and I'm like, oh, man, this is hard. Regardless, when I'm with that one person, I need to do the thing that seems like it makes the least amount of sense, which is, could I just tell you about what God's done? Knowing that Jesus is with me, just like he's with you, as we tell the story. The story ends not just with this message, but with a meal. What is it that those who are now in fellowship do together? They eat together. Notice, verse 12, this is where we're going to end. It's right here. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought a burnt offering and sacrifices to God, and Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law before God. They have a meal together. That's it. It's a rather simple meal. All they do is eat bread. They might have had other things, but what we know is that they eat bread. We know Jethro is involved in this because he's the one bringing the sacrifices to God. There's no law from God to do this. It's just trying to do some kind of outpouring of thanks. The laws about sacrifices will come later in the Bible. We don't actually know where Moses got or Jethro got the idea to do this. We can't be sure, but what we can be sure of is that they're like, look, I just want to celebrate what God has done. And they eat bread together. Now, one of the most beautiful things about the way the Bible portrays God's people in fellowship, and something that we sadly miss today, is that it's not just about you. It is about you, but it's not just about you. It's also about us. As you and I realize that we're in fellowship with God because of what he has done, then we realize that we're in fellowship with each other. And not just, by the way, you all and God. It's you all, and then all Christians everywhere. It's the craziest thing. People you'll never meet, people who you would never understand, they're in the same fellowship with you everywhere around the world. The meal they have together is not extravagant, but it is valuable because it proclaims something about who they are in relationship to the God that they're eating in front of. It's simple, but powerful. And the fellowship that you and I have is also around a meal. It's different. We aren't just kind of making it up. We're doing it because it's what Jesus said to do. But it's a simple meal. Some bread and some juice. That's all it is. Yet it proclaims that we are in fellowship with God and each other and all the believers everywhere. And all it is remembering the mighty acts of God. That God sent his Son to die and redeem, to save people like you and me. It's simple and simply profound. It's the celebration of the mightiest acts of God. So proclaim this good news, friends. And rejoice when you have the opportunity to take the Lord's Supper or communion. Simple meal, proclaiming a profound truth. And have all the hope in the world as we share the message of these mighty acts, because the proclamation of God's mighty acts produces, miraculously, God's fellowship. Let's pray. Lord, would you help us to believe these truths, to share this message, and to speak to family, friends, neighbors. Give each and every one of us who believes this story one opportunity this week to speak to somebody. As scared as we might be, as hesitant as we might be, give us just one opportunity. And for anybody who's here who doesn't believe it, would you open their eyes to the truth of who Jesus is? As we have this morning had the opportunity to simply hear once again the story of what you have done and seen family transferred into fellowship. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.